Welcome to the first of what will hopefully be many podcasts. It's Tim Wilkinson here from Exchange Chambers. I'm a barrister. I specialise in catastrophic injury or serious injury work. Alongside me is Mary Lomas, who is a solicitor from Fletcher's Group. And we're here to talk to you today primarily about motorcycle accidents, their effect not just on the individual who's unfortunately been badly injured, but also on the wider family. The role of the specialist solicitor, which is what Mary is in the claim, and the legal team more widely, which is where I come in. We work as a team together, as I say, working alongside one another, solicitors and barrister, and the services that we offer, both as a set of chambers and also with regard to Fletcher's Group more generally. I think it's probably best that we start, Mary, with talking about you and a little bit more about you and your background as a motorcyclist and your love of motorbikes, as I know that you do. Tell us a little bit more, if you could, about the work that you do with motorcyclists beyond the world of law, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I'm a specialist motorbike solicitor. I work with Fletchers, who are a specialist motorbike solicitor firm. Their heritage is motorcyclists. They were founded in the 80s by Rob and Ed Fletcher, who are motorcyclists themselves. So I worked as a solicitor for nearly 20 years now, and for about 9 or 10 of those years, I have been a specialist motorbike solicitor. So part of that is obviously the day-to-day running the cases, helping those motorcyclists who've been involved in incidents and collisions and helping them to obtain compensation. But much wider than that, I've supported the motorbike community for those years, and alongside Fletcher's now, continue to support the motorbike community with charity work and supporting a number of organisations. So we are the British Motorcyclist Federation's legal line. We also support a number of different road safety charities, for example, Staffordshire Dot Bikes, Upright Derbyshire. They encourage riders to take advanced riding courses, to do advanced riding, to think about the equipment that they're using, to think about the helmets that they're wearing, to encourage riders to stay safer on the roads. A large number of collisions are due to rider error. Some collisions, if a rider had been doing something slightly differently, they might have been less severely injured, or they might not have been injured at all. So part of what we do is encouraging motorcyclists to think about safety. One of the things that we do actually is we supply these medical data carriers to motorcyclists in collaboration with the British Motorcyclist Federation. So motorcyclists can put all their information on their medical conditions. So we have a lot of motorcyclists who are over a certain age, who are on lots of medications, for example, blood thinners. They put all the information on there, put that in that tab, stick it on the helmets, and if they come off, the medical emergency services have got the information there straight away.
Right. So there's a big focus there, obviously, on prevention of accidents. And unfortunately, when it does, or if it does occur, as you know, we both know, and we all know that these incidents do happen, then there's a situation that can arise where you are in safe hands from the outset. So in effect, you're trying to build a relationship with the motorcyclist before anything untoward ever happens.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we worry about is we don't want to come across as ambulance chasers, because that's not what we're doing. It is the case, and you know yourself, you've dealt with the most serious injuries. If a motorcyclist is involved in a collision, they're vulnerable. They're going to get the most serious of those injuries. And after years of seeing that, you want to help them. You want to get them in a position where actually, if they can, do something differently. So, for example, I've got a client at the moment, and I think it is a case that you're working with me on, actually. He'd just done an advanced riding course about 3 or 4 weeks before the incident. If he'd have been riding, so he was riding in a completely different position on the road than he would have done previously. If he'd have been riding in his usual position, he probably would have been killed in this collision. He sustained nasty leg injuries as it is, but he's grateful that he did that course. So I think part of it is encouraging bikers to take responsibility. We don't want to take away the fun of what they do, because it's a passion. I can see I go to the racing. We support a number of motorcycle races in the British superbikes.
Yeah.
And I love going watching that with my dad.
Yeah.
I don't know, have you been to the BSB?
I have, many times. It's amazing. The atmosphere is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's a real passion and the enjoyment and the thrill of riding. But also, as you say, safety is key. And it's about getting that message across to them. And that's a really good example. I mean, in that scenario, we all know that motorcyclists are vulnerable road users. They themselves know they're vulnerable road users. And part and parcel of the advanced cycling courses or motorcycling courses is to not just teach knowledge in that scenario, but also take account of the fact that other road users, cars, vans, etc., aren't as savvy as motorcyclists about their presence or what they're doing on the road. In fact, we often see that other road users sometimes resentful of motorcyclists being there.
Yeah.
And so I think you're absolutely right in terms of highlighting the need for enhancement of road safety and knowledge, not just potentially in terms of motorcyclists, but other road users as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. Part of it is the Think Bike campaign, for example. So I do a lot of work with Staffordshire Biker Breakfasts. These are events that motorcyclists attend to learn about safety, but in an enjoyable environment. Part of their campaign is the Think Bike. So, even having a sticker in a car saying Think Bike, it might encourage somebody just to glance in their mirror and notice that motorbike before they do the right turn that they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
So it's all those sort of things. It's awareness, and even with, for example, brake. I've done campaigns in the past where we've done competitions for kids, and we've encouraged them to count the number of motorcyclists or even cyclists that they see on the roads to send in how many they see. The winner wins a box of heroes.
Yeah.
For them, it's brilliant, but also it's education. It's helping them to learn to be more observant on the roads and to think about what's going on around them.
Yeah.
So it is encouraging that.
But just tell me, Mary, moving on to the more boring side of things in terms of the law itself. It's obviously, I know this and you know this, but for the audience listening and watching this, how important is it to involve what I'd call a specialist solicitor from the outset in terms of that legal team? And when, ideally, would you like to see that?
Yeah, so it's key to involve a specialist legal team right from the very start, right from the moment it happens. Everybody wants to blame a biker. Sometimes they are at fault, but when you're coming up against arguments, the exhaust, it was very noisy, they were clearly going too fast. That's nonsense. Some solicitors will immediately say, well, you were noisy, you're not going to win this. You will win this with the right help, with the right support. And also, for example, it's thinking about immediately what's required. So I've had a client, again, it's another one that you've been involved with. I had done a talk at the club, and people were a little bit skeptical. Why do we need to know about this? Why do we need to know what happens in the incident? Why do we need to know what happens with the claim? Then the lady's husband was knocked off, carpooling. A large vehicle pulled out of a side road and into him. She says she immediately felt panicked, but then she suddenly felt calm because she knew what to do. She knew what needed to happen next. So part of this was that she'd done biker down as well. So she ensured her own safety, ensured his safety, police, etc., etc. But then she knew what to do in terms of evidence gathering. She knew how to take pictures of the accident scene. And she knew how to, she thought about getting witness information, getting pictures of the registration of the other vehicle, and talking to the police. She was more confident and more able to do that because she knew she had this conversation with a motorbike specialist. And this led to a successful outcome in the case. There were arguments. It should have been really straightforward, but there were arguments because it was on a motorbike. So I think it's those small things and get us involved straight away. So there's the liability issues, which, for example, the loud exhaust, classic. Filtering arguments, another classic. Filtering isn't illegal. But there are lots of different scenarios. There are lots of things that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
And unless you've got a specialist team, they aren't going to go through those steps. They're going to automatically say it's a 50-50.
Yeah. I mean, you often see, don't you? We come across it all the time where you'll have a car or a van driver, particularly in a filtering scenario. But because motorcycles are by definition smaller, you come across this scenario where they say they came out of nowhere. They weren't seen, could only hear them, and that implies speed in itself. Filtering, or they were making their own lane. They're a law unto themselves because of this natural resentment of motorcyclists, because of the lack of awareness of a road user themselves. And I think, as you say, that's probably the key important factor, certainly as a barrister looking in, when, for example, when you instruct me, we often see scenarios where initially the car driver or the van driver, or even the witnesses, will often blame subconsciously because of a bias against the motorcyclist, whereas in actual fact, the more you delve into it, because of the experience that you've got and the background that you've got and the way that you can actually not manipulate the evidence, but gather the evidence properly, the more it becomes, as it filters through, actually, we're getting a very accurate account because of the almost reconstruction through your experience as to what actually happened here. And then, of course, you can go down the reconstruction route if you've gathered the evidence, etc., which a lot of other solicitors won't do. They'll just give up at the first hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. And it's thinking about things like the way a bike moves. A bike moves completely differently to a car.
Yeah.
And so it's thinking about those things. So although a skid mark on the road might suggest automatically a certain scenario if it was two cars, actually with a motorbike it might be a completely different scenario that's happened. And one thing that I've found really beneficial actually is doing my CBT. So CBT test, I think, should be, and this is another whole other discussion, I think the CBT should be part of the driving test because it gives you a completely different awareness about motorcyclists, and it gives you a completely different understanding about what they're doing on the roads and how they are on the roads, and it makes you a safer driver. So when you start becoming more aware of how a motorbike moves and how a motorcyclist rides and the sorts of things that they can do and can't do, it helps you understand more the accident mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in terms of, again, going back to your role specifically as a specialist motorcycle solicitor, which a lot of our listeners and viewers probably won't realise, that think most solicitors can do most things, whereas in actual fact, it really is very niche. And as you say, you've been doing it for 20 years. What early steps do you take in order to sort of establish what actually happened, and where do you take it from there?
Yeah, so initially we would want to know, in terms of liability, we'd want to know what sort of bike it was. Did it have any modifications? Was it a noisy bike by definition? We'd want to know the sort of riding history of that person. We'd want photographs of the accident scene. So if it wasn't possible to take them at the time, we completely understand that quite often people are so seriously injured they can't do it. But if somebody else is with them, there might be photographs that we can piece together. We'd want to know if there are any witnesses, and we'd want to get into contact with them straight away. We'd also be looking out for CCTV. So sometimes CCTV can be in the most unlikely places. So all of those things are helpful. Also, GoPros, helmet cameras, brilliant. If more and more riders are wearing those, and they are actually really helpful. One, because they can record if you go on a nice ride. They're a good record of your ride, so through the winter months you can look at it.
Yeah.
But for situations like this, they are actually really good.
Yeah.
I think especially for commuters. So more and more people are using motorcycles for commuting purposes. The roads are getting busier and busier. A GoPro, it's actually a good idea.
Yeah.
Because things are happening more and more frequently.
Yeah, I suppose the point behind that is the more information you can gather, the earlier, the better.
Yeah.
Because it allows you to obviously capture the moment, so to speak, not in terms of the impact itself, but in terms of capturing the whole scene. And we know evidentially that the sooner you get that, the better. So the sooner you're involved, the better.
Yeah.
It's simple as that. And not only in terms, I suspect, does that apply in terms of the liability angle, in terms of who's to blame and is there a contributory negligence argument here, but also in terms of the injury itself and the consequential losses that flow from there.
Yeah, and that is, to be honest, that is the key. That is the most important thing, the injury, because as we've said, motorcyclists, vulnerable road users, the sorts of injuries that they sustain, brain injury, amputation, degloving, horrific orthopedic injuries. It's really important to get a solicitor who is not only a motorbike specialist, but a serious injury specialist. So you want your legal team, your catastrophic serious injury. We have a whole team called Serious Injury Law, who are dedicated to dealing with just serious injury. So it's things like getting the letter of claim out as soon as possible so that you can get a request for under the rehab code for rehabilitation to be in place. So if somebody's got one of those, really serious brain injury, serious orthopedic, the rehabilitation, it's really important to get that going as soon as possible to help with any recovery that's going to take place.
And we know, don't we? I mean, again, from experience, and this is no criticism of the NHS, because they're so inundated with backlogs, etc., that somebody who goes in, even with the most severe injuries, into the NHS setting, the acute phase of their rehabilitation is looked after perfectly on the NHS, but long term, because of the need for beds, etc., then that's the critical point, really. So again, I think it's really important that your involvement is as early as possible for two reasons. One, because from a rehabilitation viewpoint, you can affect that pathway, both within the NHS setting and then beyond. But also you can form a rapport with the client. And very importantly, from my perspective as a barrister with experience of all of this, that it's very easy to forget. I know that Fletchers don't, serious injury law don't, but an awful lot of solicitors do, forget about the family and the knock-on effect of the wider family, because it's not just the motorcyclist's health that is obviously jeopardized and that person's future, but the knock-on effect of the family is just huge. And I see it time and time again where solicitors such as yourself haven't been involved from the outset. It's gone off to what I call a generic solicitor who isn't aware of the processes, who isn't working part of a wider team. And then all of a sudden, 2 years passes, they come to me as a barrister saying, we need your help here. Can you guide? And it's almost too late at that stage because the family's broken down.
Yeah.
And that to me is heartbreaking to see because it's so avoidable.
Yeah, no, it is. And I mean, I've got a recent case. It's an orthopedic injury, quite severe shoulder injury. It's devastated my client. He is on the road to recovery, so it is going to be okay. But in that immediate aftermath, it's devastating for him. He was self-employed, immediate loss of income. Immediately, all the bills fall onto his partner. She's had to change her working pattern. She's tried to hold down a job. She's tried to also look after him, help him manage his pain. So it was so important to get rehabilitation in place so that he could have that extra physiotherapy. He could have that extra advice. He could have that extra appointment with an orthopedic consultant. He could get the psychological treatment that he needed.
Yeah.
And also we could get interim payments to assist with the financial burden. So it's made the process a lot easier.
And to provide, I think a lot of people don't realise, going back to the family again, I know it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, but I quite often do this, is to provide the family with respite, because the claimant or the motorcyclist quite often feels burdensome to their family. They're at home, they can't do anything, their life's been thrown into disarray, their routine's no longer there, they're not at work, they're not earning. They're psychologically and physically, intrinsically linked, the two of them, very, very at rock bottom. And you find a situation where the family themselves, who are looking after a person, there can be an element of resentment over the longer term. And they feel terribly guilty about that because their life has been thrown into disarray as well. And just some respite, either from financially, but also more importantly, just so that they can actually live their lives a little bit, just as opposed to 24-hour care or assistance in that environment becomes very tiring on them.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's one of the things that we look at. And as a company, Fletcher's is amazing because they've developed a number of relationships with charities such as Backup and Spinal Injuries Association.
Yeah.
A lot of different charities who can also assist and step in and help with that family scenario, provide respite. They can provide weeks away. They can provide extra aids and equipment and support for the families who've never experienced anything like this, who need that extra help. So it's important to look for those links to those sorts of charities as well. So yes, primarily you want a motorbike specialist, you want a serious injury specialist, and you want a firm who's got those links to those amazing charities who can help.
And that comes to the fore even more so, I guess, when you do have a situation where liability for the accident is hugely in dispute. The defendant isn't willing to fund the rehabilitation code recommendations or the rehabilitation code at all. And you have a scenario there where you can't get interim payments. Those relationships that you've got with those charities, etc., really do come to the fore at that stage. Because of your relationship with them, you can introduce and you can actually, it's a malleable relationship in that regard. But I think importantly, where you do have a scenario where the defendant is at blame, you're in a position, given your experience in Fletcher's Group serious injury law, where you have good working relationships with insurance companies, with those solicitors that are always instructed because they're specialists as well. And you can formulate that kind of relationship to take advantage of early admissions of liability, early rehabilitation, early interim payments, and you can actually forge the path as to how that future is going to develop from a very, very early stage, which other non-specialist solicitors, we see time and time again, don't have that. In fact, they're taken advantage of in that scenario, understandably, by defendant insurance companies who are trying to save money.
No, it's true. And at Fletcher's, we're really lucky because it is a team. It's not an individual number of solicitors. It's a team. So on your team, if this happens to you, you come to Fletcher's, on your team, you're going to have a lead lawyer and you're going to have a number of other lawyers and paralegals working on your case. Each of those lawyers could be standout lawyers in their own right. And it's that team process that helps us to deliver the best service to our clients. It's things like, for example, in amputation cases, we know the best aesthetic companies to go to who will help, who will make it as painless as possible to move on to that next step of the life.
Yeah, that's what I like is, working for you guys at Fletcher's. I see time and time again that you have the entire package. So it's not just the rehabilitation, it's not just the rapport that you develop with the client. It's the fact that you've got a team of people, both in the legal sense, contacts with barristers, but also you've got the package of medical package in terms of the right experts for the right type of case, and the implementation of those plans that you can actually help implement. And that goes all the way through to when we're looking way down the line. Even early on, you can see way down the line, because of that package in place, the relevant expertise in place, you can actually predict what the future holds from a very early stage. And then you can account for it, both in terms of seeing if it works for that particular family, but also by way of trial and error, but also you can account for it in terms of the financials.
Yeah.
And so you can give an idea fairly early on, once you've got your groundwork in place and your infrastructure in place, as to what the future holds for the family.
And I think that's so important as well, because the amount of horror stories I've heard where someone's gone to a generic firm, someone's sustained a life-changing injury, but their future hasn't been thought about. So we're thinking almost straight away, how is this client's future? What's the future going to be? What's their life going to be like? We're trying to rebuild their life, and we're trying to make sure we maximise the compensation and the help that they can get and their resource package, so that they can have a meaningful life and a fulfilling life, once the claim's finished. I've heard horror stories that it might have even been one of the barristers here, actually, a client came to them, they were trying to be forced to settle a claim that's like 200 grand. It was worth over 2 million. And that's because the solicitor didn't have serious injury knowledge, and they didn't have that team of people to ensure that was in place.
Well, I think to sum up then on that basis, I think it's extremely important for anyone who's listening who is a motorcyclist and a motorcycle lover or family member of, that number one, you try and develop a relationship not on a continual basis with somebody like a Fletcher's group scenario, so that should the terrible incident happen, you're protected from the outset and you are in contact with them straight away.
Yeah.
And then you're in trusted hands, the family's in trusted hands, and you're over to experts who can take it and hold your hand as you go through that process, should that awful event occur.
And no one likes to think that it's going to happen. We hope it never does happen, but you need to have that knowledge in place. If it does happen, this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
So many people just think that they have to use the solicitors their insurers tell them to use. It's not the case. You can use whichever solicitor you want to use. And in this sort of scenario, use a motorbike specialist, use a serious injury specialist.
Yeah.
We have access to, we use the best barristers, we use exchange chambers, we use you guys. I've had so many successful cases with you. Our clients have been so happy with the results, because it's meant that they can continue to have a meaningful life that involves motorbikes once the claim's finished.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thanks very much, Mary. Hope that was interesting to everybody who's listening or watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Please feel free to provide any comments or feedback. We take that very seriously and we'd be very grateful for it. And any other suggestions on any other topics, again, we'd be really grateful to you. So thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.